An open-ended war with no boundaries. More than 12 years after the September 11th attacks, does the US president still have the authority to use military force around the world without congressional approval? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The US military says that the current American president and his successors do have all the authority they need to wage wars around the world for many more years to come, and that they can do so without approval from Congress. Soon after the 9/11 attacks, the authorization for the use of military force gave the US president the right to attack groups directly linked to those who carried out the 2001 attacks or those who harbored them. But despite repeated assertions by the Obama administration of significant blows against a much diminished al-Qaeda, a senior Pentagon official said last week on Capitol Hill that the war against al-Qaeda and its affiliates and, quote, associated forces could go on for decades.
Do you agree with me the war against radical Islam or terror, whatever description you like to provide, will go on after the second term of President Obama?
Senator, in my judgment, this is going to go on for quite a while, and yes, beyond the second term of the president.
And beyond this term of Congress?
Yes, sir. I think it's at least 10 to 20 years.
And joining me now is Jennifer Daskal. She's adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Center on Law and National Security. She also served as a lawyer at the National Security Division of the U.S. Justice Department. Also with us, Spencer Ackerman. He's a senior writer for Wired, focusing on national security for the magazine's Danger Room blog. It might not be a bad idea to use as our starting point the original text of the authorization for the use of military force, on which so much of the military action we've seen over the last 13 years has been based on. Quote, "The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September the 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons." Professor Daskal, take us back to when that was formulated. What exactly were the deliberations that went into that? Was there a consciously limited approach that was advocated at the time?
Well, if you go back to just after September 11th, 2001, you had the Bush administration pushing a much broader authorization that would have essentially asked Congress to authorize the use of military force to deter or prevent acts of international terrorism writ large. And Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, said, no, we're not going to do that. We are going to authorize what was understood as a much more limited authorization to use force against those groups, those entities. Everybody understood that to be the Taliban and al-Qaeda that were responsible for al-Qaeda. Now, over the course of the last 12 years, both administrations have interpreted this consistent with international law as covering not just al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but also what are known as their co-belligerents, or those forces that have joined forces with al-Qaeda and Taliban in the particular fight. What the concern is now is that this definition of associated forces is potentially, we don't know for sure, but potentially being expanded so far that the links to al-Qaeda and Taliban are incredibly tenuous, and it suggests a potentially disturbing delegation of authority to the executive branch.
Spencer Ackerman, as far as the authorization for the government to wage war and conduct military activity, this then remains the only authorization. We often hear about other concepts that have been introduced and so forth, but in the end, this is the basis.
That's the foundational document of what's known as the War on Terror. And you'll notice, to add on to something that Jennifer said, two very important words for the understanding and the development of that war do not appear in that document, and those words are associated forces. When we talk about al-Qaeda, when the administration talks about al-Qaeda, when the Bush administration before it talks about al-Qaeda, that concept is nested into it, the idea that a plausible, reasonable target for the United States is a member of al-Qaeda or a friend of al-Qaeda or a friend of a friend of a friend of al-Qaeda but it never actually appears in that document, and a lot of freight is put on a concept that isn't actually in that law.
But just to be clear, the words Al-Qaeda and Taliban also don't appear in that document. And so I think the administration has provided a definition of associated forces, and it's defined according to a speech that was given by the former General Counsel of the Department of Defense, an entity that has joined forces alongside Al-Qaeda or the Taliban in the fight against the United States and qualifies as a co-belligerent of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, which is a term, a concept that is taken from the laws of international armed conflict when two states are fighting against one another. So in World War II, the United States went to war, and eventually Bulgaria and Hungary and other countries joined in the United States. Those entities were considered co-belligerents of the United States enemy, and the United States was in conflict with those groups as well. The question is, and the concern is that there's no transparency as to what groups qualify as associated forces, and that's led to speculation that friends of friends, affiliates of affiliates are being shoehorned into this.
But when we're talking about drones or increased surveillance and wiretapping or indefinite detention, this is the basis for all of that, though.
Everything starts from that document.
And everything starts and I think ends with that document. That is the domestic authorization for uses of military force. There are potential alternative self-defense justifications for uses of force, but as far as one can tell from reading the text and the speeches of the administration appears to justify every single use of, or almost all uses of targeted killings through this authorization to use military force.
Without this authorization, how much authorization does the president have to embark on these sorts of operations?
Without this authorization, it would come down to self-defense authorities. And can the president exercise force consistent with his Commander-in-Chief, Article 2 self-defense authorities, and consistent with international law rules on when self-defense is appropriate?
So a question that arises from that, for instance, is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, under the normal understandings in international law of self-defense, a plausible target for U.S. military action, for drone strikes, for cruise missile strikes, for commando raids, and so forth. And it's a debatable proposition. And you understand from that why the administration would prefer, as they testified to Congress last week, to have something like that in place that allows it to say we have a wellspring of authority passed by Congress duly to allow our actions overseas to protect national security.
Let's return to that congressional testimony. And there were many instances, I think, which were slightly eyebrow-raising, to say the least. Here's a portion there with Senator John McCain asking how the president has legal authority from this AUMF to wage war beyond Afghanistan.
Mr. Taylor, in your legal opinion, could the 2001 AUMF be read to authorize lethal force against al-Qaeda's associated forces in additional countries where they're now present, such as Mali, Libya, and Syria?
As I indicated, we must comply with domestic law.
I think it's a pretty straightforward question, Mr. Taylor.
On the domestic law side, yes, sir.
You believe that the 2001 AUMF authorizes lethal force against al-Qaeda associated forces in Mali, Libya, and Syria. So we can expect drone strikes into Syria if we find al-Qaeda there?
On the domestic law side, sir, I said if, you know, I hate to speculate on a hypothetical, but...
Well, the president, in your view, the president has the authority to do that.
In my view, the AUMF authorizes us to be at war with al-Qaeda, the organization behind the 2001 September 11 attacks, and that organization continues, and it has associated forces that have joined with that organization, and yes, sir, we are authorized to attack those who have chosen to associate with that organization.
So, lots to think about there. There's this distinction there being raised between domestic and international law. And you mentioned international law just a few moments ago, but is that because there is, I mean, it's basically taken as read, and it might be quite surprising to some internationally, though, that domestic law does trump international law in the end. The U.S. isn't in the end bound by international law if domestic law says it isn't, basically.
Well, I think the U.S. does view itself as bound by international law. So international law, I mean, this didn't come up in this testimony because I think that was a particularly confused clip. I mean,
Right.
I'm not sure that, I don't think he was saying that the authorization to use military force, as it's currently understood by the administration, authorizes the use of force in Syria and Libya.
But that's what he seemed to be saying there. That's
I'm
what's so
not sure. I don't
confusing.
think that's what he was saying. I think he was saying that if certain conditions were met, it is possible that the Pentagon would perceive the authorization to use military force
So an
as
explicit
justified.
al-Qaeda presence in Syria. There.
Right, but you would still have to deal with the international law rules on sovereignty. So there still has to be an international law justification for entering into a country, into Mali or to Libya or to Syria or to any other country or to Yemen. Now, in most instances, the U.S. deals with that by getting the consent of the host country, which then raises questions about, is the host country consenting to something that doesn't seem right on a number of different levels. But that's, I mean, the U.S. still deems itself bound by the international law rules, on sovereignty.
He seemed to be making a pretty specific distinction between domestic and international.
Well, I think the U.S. has to go through the analysis.
Right.
They need to go through the analysis as what is our domestic law authority,
Right.
and what are the international law rules. And if I were in that seat, I would want to know the answer to both of those questions.
Right.
That doesn't mean that if you have the domestic law authority that you don't also have to abide by the international law rules.
Sorry, Spencer.
There's also, to better understand how many different concepts are packed into that short exchange, there's an unfortunate tendency in Washington to wrap up discussions of policy inside discussions of the law. And what it seemed like McCain and the acting general counsel of the Pentagon, Robert Taylor, were really talking about was whether it is wise as a matter of strategy to carry out strikes in places like Mali, in Libya, and so on down the line. Questions of whether it's legal or not are, to be sure, incredibly important questions. But to some degree, they're orthogonal to that broader question of does this make sense as a matter of national security?
We'll certainly develop that question as to whether this makes sense as regards national security. Let's look at another exchange then. There's this concept of associated forces, which, as you say, Spencer, isn't in the original AUMF, but is now routinely cited. Here's Senator Angus King's exchange with Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict.
I've only been here 5 months, but this is the most astounding and most astoundingly disturbing hearing that I've been to since I've been here. You guys have essentially rewritten the Constitution here today. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, clearly says that the Congress has the power to declare war. This authorization, the AUMF, is very limited. And you keep using the term associated forces. You use it 13 times in your statement. That is not in the AUMF. And you said at one point, it suits us very well. I assume it does suit you very well because you're reading it to cover everything and anything.
I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a lawyer of any kind, but let me take a brief statement about al-Qaeda and the organization that attacked us on September 11, 2001. In the 2 years prior to that, Senator King, that organization attacked us in East Africa and killed 17 Americans at our embassy in Nairobi with a loosely affiliated groups of people in East Africa. A year prior to 9/11, that same organization with its affiliates in Yemen almost sunk a U.S. ship, the USS Cole, a $1 billion warship, killed 17 sailors in the port of Aden. The organization that attacked us on 9/11 already had its tentacles around the world with associated groups. That was the nature of the organization then. It is the nature of the organization now. In order to attack that organization, we have to attack it with those affiliates.
Spencer.
So notice what's bound up in that entire discussion in the background between King and Sheehan. It's a really big existential question. What is al-Qaeda? If al-Qaeda is a very narrow band that exists as now the term to describe as al-Qaeda core, the residual followers of Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri in Western Pakistan, if that's what al-Qaeda is, then really we've got King's complaint right there, that all that document does is authorize military action against that group. But Sheehan is saying, like a lot of people in the bureaucracy for national security, in this administration and the prior administration, that that's a misunderstanding of what al-Qaeda is. That al-Qaeda is a broad, sprawling, difficult to understand, diffuse network. It's constantly changing with lots of different subgroups, splinter factions, organizations across the world. And that's really what Congress was voting in 2001 to authorize military action against. And it's quite fascinating and really rather significant that 12 years into this war, there's not an accepted definition of that foundational question of who the enemy is.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that if Congress, I mean, the easiest thing for Congress to do, the thing that this hearing was calling out for, was to Congress to demand a list, not just a list provided to the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is what the Pentagon suggested that they were willing to do, but a public list of what are the groups, what are the entities at which the United States is currently engaged in an armed conflict. The United States is not, despite all the rhetoric, the United States is very clear, the president is very clear, the United States is not engaged in a war on terror or a war on Islamic Muslimism, as several senators said in the hearing. But the United States is engaged in this war against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces, and there absolutely ought to be clarity as to who qualifies as an associated force.
There was further discussion on what exactly affiliation to al-Qaeda means. Here's an exchange between Senator Donnelly and Assistant Secretary of Defense Sheehan.
If a terrorist group is AQ affiliated, does that inherently mean that they are threatening the United States?
Yes, sir, although it's a bit murky, I hate to say, because there are groups that have openly professed their affiliations with al-Qaeda, yet in fact, as a government, we haven't completely grappled with that as of now. And so, but generally speaking, as for AUMF, as we mentioned, it has to be an organized force first, and secondly, that organized force has to be co-belligerently joined to al-Qaeda to threaten us. So when both of those factors are in place, then we have we can move forward on AUMF.
If that AQ affiliated terrorist group is operating wholly within another country, and their actions to date have involved only that country, does the AUMF still apply to them?
Senator, as we indicated, we would do a fact-intensive, careful consideration. And as Secretary Sheehan mentioned, one of the conditions is that they've become co-belligerent with al-Qaeda in its hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners.
I don't know, it's just a bit flabbergasting that, again, it seems so vague and sort of, made up as they go along. I mean, again, yes, sir, but it's a bit murky. I mean, is it good enough? And also, I mean, in practice, is it simply co-belligerents who are directly threatening the U.S. homeland, who are being attacked by the Obama policy right now, actually? I suppose is the other question. I mean,
so
does that stand?
I hope so. I mean, I certainly hope so, because I think that's the legal justification for engaging in the use of targeted killings outside of killings that are permissible as a matter of self-defense, which is more narrow than what's permissible as pursuant to an authorization to use military force. I mean, I think what Sheehan said was important, because what he was saying, and I don't think he said it very clearly, but what I interpret him as saying is that not all al-Qaeda affiliates are covered under the authorization to use military force. That there's a difference between a group that just happens to be an affiliate of al-Qaeda and a group that's defined by the administration as associated forces. But the murkiness is astounding, and the murkiness calls out for public transparency and clarity as to which groups precisely the administration deems covered.
And I'm not even talking about signature strikes and just killing people who look like they're up to no good, which is, of course, something that the Obama administration does. But I mean, even on this level, though, does it seem like it's been thought out? And are they adhering to this co-belligerency concept? I
mean, to give an example of the murkiness that Sheehan described there, I was at that hearing covering it, and I had the exact opposite interpretation from Sheehan's comments as Jennifer did. I understood it to me, from both Sheehan and Taylor's comments, I understood them to mean that by virtue of joining onto al-Qaeda or having some form of manifested sympathy or stated desire, even by, for instance, deciding to fly the al-Qaeda banner, whether or not those groups had done anything to attack U.S. targets, they were understood to be co-belligerents. Now, perhaps I'm wrong, but it seemed from that series of statements that is a plausible interpretation. And you look at how that has real-world consequences. Think of an organization like al-Shabaab in Somalia, which has formally, flown under the banner of al-Qaeda. it has not attacked the United States, but it can be, under that interpretation, a co-belligerent.
And we're getting all these assessments suggesting that actually most of these groups that we call al-Qaeda have mainly local concerns and don't necessarily affect the
Well,
US.
it does seem that from a policy perspective, the lawyers at that hearing were talking about what you could target, not necessarily what they are targeting or will target.
Right. And just, I mean, I think I agree with your concern about the murkiness. I think that if you read the written statement and you go back and look at the definition that's been publicly provided as to who qualifies as associated forces, it's pretty clear that mere ideological affinity is not enough. It has to be an organized group. It has to have entered hostilities against the United States alongside of al-Qaeda.
So then al-Shabaab is off the table then?
Unclear. I mean,
but
they are attacking
that speaks to the
al-Shabaab.
point. Indeed.
I think it depends on the facts, and I don't have enough access to the facts to know what it is that the United States believes or has evidence that al-Shabaab has done.
I do want to just very quickly play this then. This is Lindsey Graham's questioning, and this is a particularly interesting conclusion which we should play actually.
Do you agree with me that when it comes to international terrorism, we're talking about a worldwide struggle?
Absolutely, sir.
Would you agree with me the battlefield is wherever the enemy chooses to make it?
Yes, sir, from Boston to the Fatah.
I couldn't agree with you more. Do you agree with that, General?
Yes, sir, I agree that the enemy decides where the battlefield is.
The Fatah, the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. I mean, that's quite a statement. Has that been causing waves at all, do you think? I mean, was this much noticed last week when?
I mean, I don't think it's shocking to think that international terrorism spans the globe. The question is, what do you do about it? And as the United States prepares to withdraw troops from
Afghanistan, and the level of
Afghanistan,
authorization, though, I suppose.
Right, and as the United States prepares to withdraw troops from Afghanistan in 2014, in my view, it's a time to start talking about a return to peace and not an expansion of war. And it's a time to think about putting the range of extremely effective counterterrorism capabilities at the centerpiece of the United States fight against terror, including law enforcement, including counterterrorism cooperation with foreign partners, including border controls, including a range of things.
But is that the debate? I mean, the sense was, I mean, you saw McCain getting quite hot under the collar there, but his point isn't necessarily, though, that things should be reined in. It's that there should be a wider remit.
No, that was not the debate in the hearing.
Right, okay.
But I'm suggesting that we ought to, instead of using this moment to think about ways to expand the authorizations to use force and all that means in terms of the permissive rules on who can be targeted as a matter of first resort, we ought to be at a point in time where we're talking about, with the core of al-Qaeda being decimated, we ought to be talking about force as a last resort, available when needed, if necessary, but that other tools.
But are those questions being asked, Spencer Ackerman? I mean, again, it does seem like the congressional focus is going to be on expanding.
And this is one of the most fascinating backstories of this entire debate. The Pentagon, one of the reasons institutionally, it argues that it has all the authorities it needs under that document, regardless of how strained the interpretations presented are, is because in the back of the mind, they've got lots of far more bellicose senators and members of Congress who are itching to expand the definition of targetable forces that would inevitably be a centerpiece of a new debate over a 2013 model of the authorization to use military force. And this has led to some insane and dysfunctional understandings. In 2010, the new chairman of the House Armed Services Committee decided that when he went back and looked at the incoming freshman class of Congress after 2010, that only about half of the legislators currently serving had ever voted on this foundational document back in 2001, and suggested, perhaps it's time, if the administration wants to keep waging this war against a different enemy than existed in 2001, we should have a new debate and a new vote on that, which sounds completely sensible and democratic. And the administration completely said, we are not willing to engage in that question, and we want to shut the thing down, because it worried not that it would be reined in, but that its authorities would be expanded even further. And then when that happens, there creates an expectation that the war isn't even about some vaguely defined associated force of al-Qaeda, but it's suddenly against Hamas, it's suddenly against Hezbollah, it's suddenly against Iran, and you can run all down through the list. When you have a senator like John McCain talking about a war on radical Islam, that doesn't mean anything about co-belligerent forces responsible for 9/11 and on down that train of thought. It means something far, far greater.
I suppose then the question is, what is this war on terror really about, which we'll have to leave for another time. Spencer Ackerman, thank you very much. Professor Jennifer Daskell, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.